when we talk about the historical contextualization, or rather the dharmic contextualization of the Kumbh, we have to look at the Vedic literature, right? The Vedic literature, particularly with respect to the Rig Veda, the Yajur Veda, and the Sam Veda. Also, very importantly, Kand 4 and Kand 19 of the Atharva Veda, right? There are specific aspects thereof. In Shlok Kand 4, Sukta 34, Mantra 7. Here, if you see, there are very interesting two words which come in here, right? One is with respect to the word Kumbhascha Turdhaha. That is basically telling you that there are, Chatur means four, right? Kumbha means pot or vessel, right? Or the pitcher that I was talking about. So in this shloka, they're talking about the person, the seer, who is kind of moderating the entire proceedings, because Atharva Veda talks about different elements of orthopraxy, saying that I give you 4 pots, right, filled with nectar. May all these streams move towards you, right, and may they remain in a heavenly dimension, in a heavenly realm, so to say, filled with sweetness, and may the sacred waters stand around you. There seems to be an antiseptic substance present in the waters of the Ganges and the Jamuna river. Hankin's work as well as this current work that has been done both show that the waters of these places, these confluences, especially with respect to the Sangam, is something which is of significance. Namaskar. When millions converge at a point in space and time, they don't just create history, they bend the fabric of human experience itself. Picture this: 3 sacred rivers coming together in a confluence of cosmic metaphysics and mathematics with faith, in what can be construed as the greatest experiment of human collective consciousness. In Triveni Sangam, where the mighty Ma Ganga embraces the sacred Ma Yamuna, and the mystical Ma Saraswati whispers about forgotten knowledge, something wonderful, something amazing unfolds. But what if I were to tell you that beneath the surface of the sacred rituals lies an understanding of science? What if I were to tell you that the DNA of this ancient gathering that has been going on from times immemorial, there are various ideations of astronomical cycles, of fluid dynamics, of social behavior? To discuss all this and more, I bring to you today a rather nuanced perspective where we'll be exploring different aspects of where science comes into the picture with respect to celestial bodies, with respect to Jyotish Ganita, for instance, the mathematics of astronomical nuances that go into understanding about the Kumbh Mela, as well as the aspects of bacteriophages, which connects to the work by Hankins in the latter part of the 19th century, and which relates to the idea that Ganga Jal, as we all know in all our households, has a certain aspect of self-correcting tendency, which helps with various aspects of health itself. And thereafter, looking at a little bit on the modern nuances of crowd control with technology at the very frontiers, be it artificial intelligence, drone technology, or various other aspects of surveillance and assessment and monitoring. So when we talk about the Kumbh Mela, right, what is the Kumbh Mela, right? So the Kumbh Mela relates to the word Kumbh, right, which is to do with the pitcher, right? So it is a very important mega gathering, as you would, which looks at the aspect of ritual bathing of the devotees at the confluence of 3 very important rivers for us, civilizationally, spiritually, Ma Ganga, Ma Yamuna, and Ma Saraswati. There is a very interesting tale as to how it all began. We are all familiar with the tale of the Samudra Manthan, right? The churning of the oceans, when the Asuras and Devtas came together to churn, so to say, the oceans to bring forth elixir or Amrit. So when the Devas and Asuras were churning the ocean, Dhanvantri, right? Dhanvantri was the one who emerged with a pot of the elixir, the Amrit, right? And to make sure that the Asuras don't get it, right? There's a very interesting story about how Indra's son, Jayant, right? He ran off with the pot, right? He runs off with the pot. Surya Dev, his son Shani, Brihaspati, and the moon go along to protect the pot, right? So while handling that pot, it just so happens that 4 drops of the elixir or the Amrit, right, falls on 4 different places, right? So these places are Nashik, Ujjain, Prayagraj, and Haridwar, right? So that's where we have the Kumbh Mela, right, being organized based on certain kinds of calculations, certain alignments of celestial bodies, which I'll be discussing during my talk. And what is very interesting this year, right, besides the fact that we have had an event which comes after 144 years, right? The Mahakumbh is a very, very special occasion that comes after 144 years. But also this year and the last year, we have had discussions about the Kumbh Mela at Bansberia in West Bengal, which has happened after 700 years, so to say. And this is where the Ganga, Jamuna, and Saraswati, which are actually tributaries of the Bhagirathi Hooghly in Bengal, come together. And it is believed that Yukta Veni, right, which means connected, that which is connected at Prayagraj, right, becomes disentangled or disconnected or liberated, so to say, Mukta Veni, right, Yukta Veni to Mukta Veni at the Tribeni Sangam. Right? So it's a very interesting time that we are living in, where we have the Mahakumbh that's happening this year, a celebration and emotion, a very important civilizational landmark, a milestone for us in the modern age as we go forward. Now, when we talk about the historical origins of the Kumbh Mela, we hear about historical accounts, right? We hear about accounts from the times of Maharaj Harshvardhan, for instance, who lived around 590 to 647 AD. And especially the Chinese traveler Hyun Sang documented the gatherings at Prayagraj, which was facilitated by King Harshvardhan. And this was, very interestingly, not quite necessarily the Kumbh Mela for that matter. I mean, it was with a frequency of 5 years. He mentions in his text about this recurring gathering at Prayagraj after 5 years. Whereas, as we all know, the Kumbh Mela has a frequency of 12 years and the Ardha Kumbh of 6, and the Mahakumbh that we are witnessing right now of 144 years, right? So the formal organization of the festival itself is often attributed by many of the akhadas, many of the monastic orders that are part of the Kumbh Mela to Sri Adi Shankaracharya ji as well. And but this has not been conclusively proven. It's a matter of discussion. And the interesting part is that before the 19th century, there is no extant historical documentation per se. Obviously, there is a lot of oral records, a lot of collective memory, so to say. But Kumbh as itself at Prayagraj, right, has not been spoken of all that much. Early sources like the Matsya Puran, the Chaitanya Charitamrita, and Tulsidas Ramcharitmanas as well refer to a Magh Mela, right? A Magh Mela at Prayagraj, not quite a Kumbh Mela. The interesting part is the Kumbh itself, the Kumbh Mela, is actually probably started in Haridwar, and I'll come to the reason as to why that is the case, because when we're talking about celestial alignments, the idea of the Kumbh, right, the Kumbh also connects to the Kumbh Rashi, right, which is the way in which Brihaspati or Jupiter, when it is in the Kumbh Rashi, that is when the Kumbh Mela is undertaken. So that is when it happens at Haridwar. So we'll come to that shortly. But in Prayagraj itself, there is no extant historical record before the 19th century. The Magh Mela itself is very interesting, however, because the Magh Mela is part of a long tradition of these festivals, river festivals, called Pushkaram, right? So you may have heard about the Pushkar, Mela, Pushkar, the city itself in Rajasthan, but Pushkaram is something which is a much older kind of, civilizational or cultural element. So the Pushkaram basically looks at the transition of Jupiter into various zodiac signs, right? So these river festivals, they kind of rotate between different, centers, so to say, and rivers as well. And each is when Jupiter is in one of the respective zodiacs, which are associated to those rivers, so to say, right? So in terms of the history of that, there is a text called the Jataka Parijata, right? Jataka Parijata. And a Brahmin named Pushkara was granted the ability to live within water, right, and purify the waters while doing so, right? So this is a very interesting anecdote. And so at Brihaspati, which is Jupiter's request, he entered each of the 12 sacred rivers of Bharatvarsh, right, one at a time, corresponding to the transition of Brihaspati with respect to all the different zodiac signs, right? So that is how we have the different pushkarams, right, which are relating the respective rivers to specific zodiacs where the Brihaspati, when the Brihaspati traverses into it, right? So the Magh Mela is also mentioned in Tamil anthologies as well, right, where it has been looked at in terms of the Tamil month of Thai, which falls in January, February, roughly. And that is basically looks at water sports, fairs. There's a lot of festive cheer, the celebration of that period, so to say. In Sikhism, Magh Mela, known as Maghi, right? It also has been recognized by Guru Amar Das Ji. And there is a commemoration of the 40 martyrs of the 1705 Muslim-Sikh war that also is looked at a large gathering in Muktsar, right, in Muktsar, and this roughly coincides with the Magh Mela or the Maghi within Sikhism, right? So it's very interesting how the evolution would have happened and how we can track that, beginning with Pushkaram, right, then going on to Magh Mela, which looks at specific renditions or editions of the Pushkaram, and then moving ahead towards the Kumbh Mela, which we today witness within in Prayagraj as well as in 3 other cities that I have already mentioned. Now, when it comes to the Mahakumbh, which is currently happening, right, we are seeing anywhere between 65 to 70 lakh people. The Shahi Snan on the 29th, we are expected to have about 6 crore people coming together. I don't think there is anywhere in the entire world or in the chronicles of history that we have had such positive reinforcement of what we call as collective consciousness, so to say. And it is quite a wonderment. It is quite an amazing feat of of spontaneous self-organization, if you will, for people to come together on the basis of religion, on the basis of their faith, and on the basis of what they strongly and truly believe in. So on the first day itself, which was January 13th of this year, there were about 1.65 crore people who had gathered. And on the 14th, that rose to 3.5. Now, what is very interesting, and I'll come to that at the very end of my talk, is the manner in which artificial intelligence, right, has been deployed and has really helped in terms of command and control in this edition of the Kumbh Mela. The Mahakumbh itself, there are certain specific periods in the Mahakumbh or the Kumbh Mela in general where, which is of significance, right? And that follows the lunar calendar primarily. So for instance, the Purnima, the Amavasya, and so on and so forth, and I'll come to that as well. How that actually is looked at as a period when there is a lot of charging of the waters, so to say, right? And that aspect of the charging of the waters, right, of how celestial alignments can or cannot, right, look at how it helps with human health, human well-being, right, is also a very important aspect that I would like to explore going ahead. Right, so the Mahakumbh, as I already mentioned, is being organized right now. I would like you to look at this very interesting tapestry. It's an image, which is a Southeast Asian image, and it looks at the Samudra Manthan. And it's very interesting because you look at Prayagraj and Haridwar, right, and it also has something known as the Ardh Kumbh, right? Ardh Kumbh is basically the half. Ardh means half. So Ardh Kumbh means every 6 years, right? So here you can see how there is a certain way in which the Asuras and Devas are kind of, trying their best to churn it as best as they can. And then there's Brahmaji, and then there is Jayant. If you see on the left-hand side, Jayant, who's Indra's son, how he is trying to kind of ensure that the demons, Asuras, don't get the elixir, so to say, right? And so it's a very interesting tapestry that I wanted to show all my viewers here today. So when we talk about the Mahakumbh, as you all may have seen during the recording of the proceedings that have been happening, you may have seen the very first event, which was a very interesting event called the Chavni Pravesh, which is basically also called the Peshwai sometimes. The Chavni Pravesh is basically the royal entry procession, right? It's the procession of all the different akharas, the monastic bodies, the sadhus, the revered sadhus who come together based on the different akharas. They have a certain kind of way in which they come forth. There are a lot of different celebrations. There are skits, for instance, which I will show you, one Chavni Pravesh of the Niranjani Akhada as well. Now, when we talk about the historical contextualization, or rather the dharmic contextualization of the Kumbh, we have to look at the Vedic literature, right? The Vedic literature, particularly with respect to the Rig Ved, the Yajur Ved, and the Sam Ved. Also, very importantly, Kand 4 and Kand 19 of the Atharva Ved, right? There are specific aspects thereof. For instance, in Shlok Kand 4, Sukta 34, Mantra 7, right? Chaturaha kumbascha turdhaha dadami shirena purna udkena dagnaha etastva dhara upyantu sarvaha swarge loke madhumatmad vinamana uptva tishtantu pushkarini samantaha, right? So here, if you see, there are very interesting two words which come in here, right? One is with respect to the word kumbascha turdhaha, right? So there, when you say Chaturaha Kumbascha Turdaha Dadami, that is basically telling you that there are, Chatur means 4, right? Kumbha means pot or vessel, right? Or the pitcher that I was talking about. So in this shloka, they're talking about the person, the seer, who is kind of moderating the entire proceedings, because Atharva Ved talks about different elements of orthopraxy, saying that I give you 4 pots, right, filled with nectar and complete with milk and water, so to say. May all these streams move towards you, right, and may they remain in a heavenly dimension, in a heavenly realm, so to say, filled with sweetness, right, filled with sweetness, and may the sacred waters stand around you. Right? Now, it's very interesting. Pushkarini, that you have seen, the word that is there at the very end of the second section, right, or the second last word out there, Pushkarini is from the word Pushkar that I had spoken about previously, right? So, when you say Kumbha and Pushkarini, you see a very interesting aspect where things are being brought together in a manner of speaking, right? Now, in Atharva Ved, Kand 19, Sukta 53, Mantra 3, you again have a certain reference, so to say, which says Purnaha Kumbhodhi Kalaha Ahitastha Vei Pashyomi Bahuda Nu Santaha Sa Ima Vishwa Bhuvnani Prayatnakala Tamahu Parme Vyoman. Here, basically, what it is saying is that the universe itself is like a vessel which is existing on the basis of time, of Kal, basically, right? And that we are evolving, right? We are evolving, we are becoming, and that which is present up front, right? Before all these worlds of the universe, right? The sages have denoted that in terms of Kal, right? In terms of time itself. And that is extending up to the transcendent heaven that we talk about as well. Right? So very interesting. In Atharva Ved, in the first case, it is basically with respect to the universe itself being referred to as, in the second case as Kumbha, right, which is the vessel. In the first case, it is looking at Kumbha as something that the preceptor is giving to the other, and in that respect, the idea of Pushkar, Pushkarini, comes into the picture as well, right? So it's a very interesting aspect which connects to what I have been discussing before this, right? So the Kumbh Mela is a rare occasion also because many of the monastic orders, right? I mean, for instance, the Naga Sadhus, right? The Parivrajakas, right, the Urdhvahurs, they all come together at this place with their different ideas and traditions. Some of them also bring certain manuscripts as well, right? There has been a history of some of them bringing even artifacts, manuscripts that connect to their own respective akhadas, their own respective traditions. And it is a convergence of all these disparate elements at one place, right? Which is an amazing, civilizational dimension or an event, so to say. I'm showing you this slide here, which is a graphic. This is basically of the Niranjani Akhada and their Chavni Pravesh at the Mahakumbh Mela. So you can see the various different elements which are so interesting. So you have the sadhus themselves coming in camels, right? So it's a wonderful, interesting way in which colorful camels, covered with different kinds of, fabrics, decked up, right, with different kinds of elements. So beautiful to look at. And this is, mind you, this is called a royal procession, right? So back in the day, this was actually looked at as, because the sadhus are the royalty, so to say, when it comes to the Kumbh, right? Then you have the Naga sadhus. You can see some of the Naga sadhus coming into the event, followed by a whole lot of devotees, a whole lot of people who align with their way of thinking, so to say. There is a small fire kind of a performance, so to say, as well. Then you have somebody who's enacting a skit with Shivji, and all in raiments that are aligned with presenting what they are trying to present here. And then you have Hanumanji, right? You have Hanumanji coming in terms of three different actors, and actually these are part of the Niranjani Akhada in some form, and they have come together to enact certain stories from the life of Hanumanji here. And then finally you have the Mahant, as well as various important preceptors and other members of the Niranjani Akhada as well. So this is just one Akhada's Chhavni Pravesh, right? So there are many such, all the different akharas have a Chhavni Pravesh, and it's a real site to look at, essentially, right? So moving forward, so basically the timing of the event itself is influenced by a lot of different cosmic forces, so to say, or that is how it has been documented, it has been spoken about. And in the Chhavni Pravesh, when we talk about the Chhavni Pravesh's timing, right, and the timing of the start of the Kumbh Mahakumbh, there is a celestial alignment of three different celestial bodies, the Sun, the Moon, and Jupiter, which plays a pivotal role in determining how and when and where we will be undertaking the various events of the Kumbh Mela. Now, the question, as a person who has a strong faith within the dharmic traditions, as well as somebody who comes from the scientific realm, so to say, is with regards to whether there is, where do we stand with respect to the alignments? How can we understand them better, right? And is there a way where we can assess whether the celestial bodies do in fact impact the human anatomy, the physiology, or in any other form, the various dimensions of well-being of human beings, so to say, right? But before I move forward, I would like to highlight this very interesting line that I saw in a recent article, which is, do our Vedic texts mention the unique pilgrimage of the Kumbh Mela, right? This was at Sahapedia that I found this. And there is one aspect, one bit of the line that I would like to read out here. The knowledge of the Roman/Western zodiac signs, one of the most important factors behind the festival, was unknown to the Vedic people. Okay? India became familiar with the Western zodiac only around the beginning of the Christian era, ... right? Now, the thing is, the idea that Western zodiac signs were pivotal, were fundamental to the organization of the Kumbh Mela is ludicrous, right? It is absolutely absurd, because the tradition of Jyotisha, of astronomy, mind you, not quite astrology alone, it is about mathematics and astronomy, as I will be shortly expanding on, has been there from times immemorial within India itself, within Bharat, right? And in fact, when I come to the ideas of the zodiac signs themselves, right, from the Indian perspective and from the Western perspective, we will see that the Indian zodiac signs, or the Indian aspects of how we look at zodiac, the definition of zodiac itself, is more aligned with the scientific way we do it, right? Because if, for instance, right now we talk about the Western zodiac and the astronomical data that we see out there, right? If I say that, let's say Jupiter is in XYZ zodiac, the Indian zodiac is actually aligned with the astronomical data, right? Whereas the Western zodiac is actually off by a certain amount. And the reason for that is something known as precession of the Earth, which is not accounted for by the Western zodiac system, right? So I'll come to that shortly. But before that, the Indian system of astronomy, of astrology, of mathematics, I like to think of it as more of a timekeeping exercise, something where we are correlating with the various frequencies, the various time scales of the universe, so to say, right? Not quite in terms of astrology, because given that it has been looked at from a Western perspective, it has a certain baggage that I feel we should not be annotating to a certain tradition within Indian knowledge systems, which is Ganita Jyotisha, right? Which has much more to it than just the astrological aspect, so to say, right? So Ganita Jyotisha is basically the Indian synthesis of mathematics and astronomy, right? Very simply put, right? Ganita Jyotisha, right? Ganita Jyotisha. And so the idea that celestial timekeeping, celestial phenomena, right, has a very significant, very rigorous mathematical way in which we approach it is encapsulated in the way it is termed itself, right, which is Ganita Jyotisha, right? So in Ganita Jyotisha, it is prominently featured in various Vedic texts, right? For instance, in the Vedanga Jyotisha, right, it says that Jyotisha itself is one of the 6 auxiliary sciences, right, the Vedangas, essential for Vedic rituals. So the idea of how the mathematics of it is undertaken is also reflected in other elements of religious orthopraxy, right? For instance, the way we look at the Havan Kund, right? The place where we do the yagya, right? There is a very elaborate way in which the orientation of the different levels of that, right, the construction of it is also determined with respect to geometry, which has been encapsulated in the Sulba Sutra, for instance, and in many other treatises which have looked at it extensively, right? So in the Vedanga Jyotisha, it looks at calculating time, right? It looks at determining the auspicious moments, the muhurt, right, which we talk about, muhurta, and also predicting eclipses, because it seeks to maintain a harmony between the human and the cosmic rhythm, so to say, or the occurrences, right? Now, Surya Siddhanta has been often spoken about as a very important text, right, in this context, and I completely agree with that, because it looks at various mathematical techniques to determine the planetary positions, for instance, based on observations, right? It has spoken about the sinusoidal function, the sine functions, and has looked at algorithms, right? This is very important because the algorithmic thinking is something which is very intrinsic to the Indian knowledge systems, both in the context of Sanskrit, right, as a language itself, which has been looked at in the computational sense in today's age, as well as in terms of different treatises like the Surya Siddhant, for that matter, right? So what is the algorithm about? The algorithm in the Surya Siddhant is, one of the algorithms is about the distances between different celestial bodies, right? So we today, with our advanced techniques and telescopes and so on and so forth, talk about different distances in terms of astronomical units, AUs, right? Back in the day, there were other ways in which it was done with referencing, right? And the manner of doing it has been elaborated in the Surya Siddhant, so to say. And of course, in that you have trigonometry, you have the ways of marking the reference points with which you are determining the distances, so to say, right? So all in all, we can say that the cosmos was perceived as an ordered system which is regulated by mathematical order, right? Which is regulated by principles that need a rigorous study, right? It's not just about subjective interpretations, it is about something fairly objective in its own right, right? So that is something I would like to highlight here when I start with this discussion of Ganita Jyotisha, right? Now, Ganita Jyotisha, unfortunately, had different interpolations over time as well, right? I mean, the Hellenistic traditions, when the Greeks came to the Indian subcontinent, there was an intermixing of different ideas. So the Yavana Jataka, right, which was translated from Greek to Sanskrit in the 2nd century CE, and the Spuji Dhwaja, right, these are various treatises which look at this integration of the Hellenistic thinking with the Indian thinking, so to say. And I would strongly believe, and this is my perception having looked at different works when they talk about Ganita Jyotisha and the mathematics thereof, as well as the relevance to modern astronomy and the alignment thereof. One question that always came to mind is that where did we go so much into the other nuances, right? And whether that was something purely from the Indian perspective, or whether there were other aspects as well, right? So here the Hellenistic interpolations at times reinforce the astrological aspects more, right? Shifting the focus from fairly astronomical and rigorous mathematical calculations towards personalized interpretations, right? Which is a very tricky thing to work with, right? In the sciences, for that matter, right? I mean, it's not saying that we didn't have these interpretations beforehand as well, because obviously when we talk about muhurtas, when we talk about different elements of life, that is very much so, very much there. But however, having said that, when it is premised on mathematics and premised on astronomical calculations, it is slightly different in the way we orient it, we premise it in terms of the rigor of what we are doing, right? Now, when we talk about Ganita Jyotisha, I mean, having spoken about the Hellenistic interpolations, and I'll go a little bit into the Western zodiac as well, Aryabhatta is always stands out as a luminary in the Ganita Jyotisha area, right, in the realm of Ganita Jyotisha. And he was the one who gave us the idea that the earth is actually rotating around a certain axis, right? The axial motion, right, of the stars, actually he talked about the apparent axial motion of the stars was because the earth completes a certain rotation itself, right? And he gave a certain value, right? He said 23 hours, 56 minutes, 4.1 seconds, right? That was the value he gave forth. And this is remarkably correct up to a certain point, because modern measurements also gave about 23 hours, 56 minutes, 4.09 seconds, right? So you see the matching of sorts. There is a slight confusion whether heliocentricity was proposed by him. I wouldn't go that far in terms of claiming that, but there definitely was axial motion of the sun, which was elaborated by him in his works. And he himself looked at different time scales, right, different time cycles. For instance, he defined a yuga in terms of 43,20,000 years, right, 43,20,000 years. And he calculated that the earth would rotate roughly around 158 crore, 22,37,500 times in one yuga, right? Now, you may ask, why such massive scales, right? One of the reasoning which people have often thought about is that the idea of fractions, right, how fractions are looked at, is obviously much better worked with when you have such a large value, right? So in terms of precise calculations, by avoiding fractions, this does help. And the number 43,20,000 years, which was one yuga, was particularly useful as it was divisible by many other commonly found astronomical numbers, right? So there's a whole way in which this was looked upon or determined, which obviously goes beyond the scope of the current discussion. Now, heliocentricity, however, was discussed by somebody from India, right? It was discussed by Nilakantha Somayaji, right, in the 15th century. And he spoke about this very interesting model where Mercury and Venus orbit around the sun, right, which in turn orbits around the earth. So it was not quite heliocentric in that manner. It was more like what we call as a later Tychonic model, right, which has a certain degree of nesting, so to say, right? So two of the planets around the sun, which around the earth, and so on and so forth, right? So there is a certain kind of qualified heliocentricity, right? It's not quite heliocentricity in the context we know it as today. So now, coming to the astronomical perspective with respect to the Mahakumbh, right? Let's get into that. So this first slide, or which I would like to show you in this context, is of the astronomical position of Jupiter on the 13th of January 2025 from the location Prayagraj. You can see this is a sky chart, as it is called, right? And this is courtesy the Sky Live. Those of you who are interested can go to this site. This gives you an idea about where the different celestial bodies are placed in real time, right? So at a certain hour, minute, second, you can define at a certain time, and then you get it, right? So here you see that Jupiter is placed in this very interesting area, which is basically just off the Taurus constellation, right? The Taurus constellation. You can also see Venus, you can see the Crab Nebula, which is a very well-known astronomical element, so to say, right? So the Jupiter is in Taurus. Please, that is something that we will refer to later on, right? Now, in terms of the astronomical position of the sun, right, on 13th of January 2025 from Prayagraj, we see that the nearby areas which we talk about can be Capricorn, there is Sagittarius, the Wild Duck Cluster, and very close by Pluto, which no longer is a planet as per the International Astronomical Conventions. And so now, please keep that in mind, because we'll come to that later on in terms of the discussion of how we determined when do we actually have the Kumbh, right? That is a very important aspect, and especially in Prayagraj, right? So Jupiter, and here I have not shown you, but this the sun actually moves towards Aries, right? It moves towards Aries, the Mesh Rashi. And even in the astronomical sense, it will kind of move in a certain direction. In terms of the Jupiter, you have it in Taurus, right? That is what is of importance. Now, this graphic is very interesting because, we often talk about the size of Jupiter, but Jupiter is actually an extremely large planet. However, with respect to the sun, it is, just about like these small marble balls kept in a large vase, right? The vase being the sun and the marble balls being Jupiter. Now, why have I shown you these two? It is the alignment of Jupiter with the sun, which is the reference point for all the different Kumbh Melas, right? So I'll come to this table, right, which is in the next slide here. So the Prayagraj Kumbh Mela is organized when Jupiter is in the zodiac Vrishab Rashi, right, which is basically Taurus, and the sun is in the Makar Rashi. Sun is going towards Capricorn, right? It's not towards the Mesh, right? So Capricorn, which you can see on the top of this sky chart that I showed for the sun, and sun goes towards Makar Rashi. In Haridwar, Jupiter goes towards, and this is very important, towards the Kumbh Rashi. Right, Jupiter goes towards the Kumbh Rashi in the Haridwar Kumbh Mela, and the sun is in the Aries or Mesha Rashi. That is the reason Kumbh is the word Kumbh comes from, essentially, right? Kumbh Rashi, and that makes sense because we heard about how from the Pushkarams to the Magh Mela to the Kumbh Mela, the progression has been around Brihaspati, right? So Brihaspati being in the Kumbh Rashi gave rise to the Kumbh Mela, so to say, right? Now, when we are talking about the other aspects, for instance, historically, there has been discussion that the original Kumbh Mela was always in Haridwar, Rishikesh, right? And this is a good evidence that that may well have been the case, right? Because it is only in the Haridwar Kumbh Mela that this interesting aspect of Jupiter being in Kumbh Rashi comes forth, right? The sun being in the Aries or Mesh Rashi. In Ujjain, it is when Jupiter is in Leo, right? Simha Rashi, and sun is in Aries, Mesha Rashi, right? So in this case, it is called the Simhastha Kumbh, right? Simhastha Kumbh because Simha, right? Simha is Singha or Simha is basically to do with the lion, right? The Leo kind of, the Leo constellation. Nashik, it happens when Jupiter is in the Leo Rashi, Simha Rashi, and the sun is also in the Leo Rashi, Simha Rashi, right? So actually, Ujjain and Nashik both are, in a manner of speaking, and have been referred to as Simhastha Kumbh Melas, right? Or Simhastha Melas, so to say, right? So this is the complete manner in which we kind of come across with respect to determining where and when the Kumbh Melas take place, right? So there's a very interesting clock that I've shown you. There are 4 clocks actually. The Prayag Kumbh, the Haridwar Kumbh, Ujjain Kumbh, and Nashik Kumbh. So you can think of it as hours and minutes hands, so to say, right? The hands of a watch, of a clock, right? And the sun, when it is at exactly some position and Jupiter at a certain other position, you will have the different Kumbh Melas, right? So a natural question is, why not the other permutations and combinations? That is because, as I said, in the Pushkaram, right, as well as in various other derivative festivals or events, so to say, spiritual events, we have the various other combinations as well, right? But it just so happens that for various historical and spiritual reasons, the Prayag, Haridwar, Ujjain, and Nashik, right, are at these specific points in time, right? So this is an interesting and important area of understanding, right? Now, when we talk about Jyotish, right, we talk about something known as the sidereal zodiac, right? The sidereal zodiac. And when we talk about Western astrology, we talk about the tropical zodiac, right? Now, there is a slight difference between the two, right? So Western astrology is often seen as pseudoscientific, right? So in the Western parlance, you may have often heard about people saying, well, astrology is not scientific enough, right? It doesn't have a basis, right? Well, partially that is correct, right? Because we're talking about Western astrology, right? When we talk about Indian astrology or Jyotisha, it is grounded in a very profound, a very ancient cultural and philosophical, but more importantly, astronomical and mathematical perspective, right? Which I had touched upon in the last few slides. Now, sidereal Jyotisha is based on observable skies, right? The observable sky that you have. And most importantly, right, there is something known as the precession of the earth, right? The earth is basically, you can think of it as a wobble, right? The earth is wobbling, so to say, right? It's not quite moving in a very uniform one plane kind of, rotation in one plane kind of motion, right? So this precession is often not accounted for by the tropical zodiac, right? However, in the sidereal zodiac system, right, which is what Jyotisha looks at, there is something known as Ayanamsha, which is basically the correction that you do for the precession, right? The correction that you do for the precession. Now, I will come to some of the Ayanamshas as we go along, right? So, tropical astrology basically defines zodiac signs starting from 0 degree Aries in the March equinox, right? And based on the northern hemisphere seasonal cycle, right? The sidereal and tropical zodiacs, while they may have been aligned, people say 2000 years back, right? But because of this precession, right, the sidereal signs lag about 23 degrees behind the tropical signs as we in 2020, right? In 2020, the sidereal signs were lagging by 23 degree, which is a very large value when it comes to the way we look at the astronomical data behind the tropical signs, right? So showing us that there is a massive difference between how we look at the zodiac from the Western perspective and the Indian perspective with respect to the astronomy that we're talking about, right? So this is this triangle, so to say, is very important, right? So there are many different Ayanamsha. There is Yukteswar Ayanamsha, there is Lahiri Ayanamsha, and so on and so forth, right? So Lahiri Ayanamsha, for instance, is something which is widely used, right? And so one very other interesting aspect which I wanted to highlight here is that the sidereal Ayanamsha, or the sidereal zodiac, looks at the different sizes of the constellation and accounts for that, right? For instance, if I go back to the slide where I was showing you the sky chart, you will see that some of the constellations are smaller in size and some are fairly well extended out, right? So for instance, if you look at Aquarius, right, or let's say even Taurus for that matter, right, it has a certain kind of aspect to it which is fairly extended, right? Now sidereal astrology, or at least sidereal Jyotisha, looks at the actual constellation sizes, right, and includes constellation beyond the 12 zodiac framework, right? So in contrast, tropical astrology looks at only 12 very specific equal 30-degree sections, right? It doesn't look at the different variations of the constellations, right? So that is another very important point. Now, the Lahiri Ayanamsha is what is used most often in Vedic astrology. This Ayanamsha aspect has also been looked at in the Western context, mind you, right, from potentially being motivated by the Vedic astrology with things like the Fagan-Bradley Ayanamsha, which has been spoken about as well. In IAU, which is the International Astronomical Union, right, the constellation boundaries are consistent with additions, right? There are many additions of constellations like the Ophiuchus and the Cetus, right? They are not considered valid in various different traditions, but in Jyotisha there is a certain discussion which is again beyond the scope of this talk, but which also looks at the various different possibilities thereof, right? So firstly, the different sizes of the constellations, and thereafter the calculations with respect to the actual observation. And most importantly, the correction for the precession aspect, which is covered by the Ayanamsha, the concept of the Ayanamsha, right? That is very important. Now, let's talk about the moon for a bit. This is the astronomical position of the moon on 13th of January 2025. And this is from Prayagraj, again from the Sky Live. So you can see that this is actually hovering around the Gemini and quite close to the Taurus. Jupiter you can see on the top right hand side, right? Now if you talk about the Kumbh Mela, you all may have heard about the Shahi Snan. On 13th of January we had a Shahi Snan, right, which coincided with the Paush Purnima, right? The Paush Purnima, basically when you have the full moon, right, of Paush Mas, and 29 January would be the Paush Amavasya, right? So on that day we are expected to have about 6 crore people that I just mentioned, and that is when you have the new moon, right, of the Paush Mas. And then the 12th of February would be the Maghi Purnima, right? The Maghi Purnima, again the full moon for the Magh, the month of Magh, right? So in that way you can see that the lunar cycle is defining, right, in many ways how we are looking at the energetic aspects or the spiritual aspects, so to say, and the importance thereof, right? Now, a natural question that should come to your mind for all the viewers out there is, how does, I mean, going besides the spiritual aspect, which is obviously central to this whole discussion, does the celestial body, which is the moon here, or let's say the celestial bodies like the sun and Jupiter, right, do they have a significant and meaningful impact in terms of the science of it, right, the science thereof, right? And that is a very interesting discussion that people have often asked me about, right, because we are talking about different constellations, different celestial bodies, and how they're impacting, right, us as individuals, as a society as well, right? So the influence of celestial bodies on humanity. So the first thing that comes to mind, this picture, this amazing picture of a massive tide, right? A tide that is coming into the beach front, right? And that is, as you may all know, because of the lunar influence, right? So here I would like to show you this slide, which is showing you 5 different aspects of tides, so to say. So the first aspect, of course, is talking about the gravitational pull between the moon and the earth, right? So there's a gravitational pull. Now the moon's gravitational pull tends to cause the oceans to bulge, right? They bulge around both on the side which is closest to the moon as well as the side which is farthest away, right? So there becomes, it's like a flattened out kind of shape that you see out here in the image, right? And this creates the high tides, right? This is the high tide, and the low points that you see, right, which is more kind of suppressed, that is the low tide, so to say, right? And so there are various other tangential forces also that contribute, but we will not be going into that all that much. And as we go along, as we rotate with the Earth, right? The Earth is itself rotating. So there are different aspects which we have to account for. There are land forms, for instance, right? There are land continental forms. The shape of the Earth itself is not quite spherical. So there are many different aspects which one has to look at. So, but broadly speaking, in the third panel that you see out here, when we go along with the Earth, we experience the different kinds of tides, right? Now, when we have the moon and the sun coming together, right, either in completely in a collinear way, right? What does it mean? That they are in the same line, right? So the moon is either between the Earth and the sun, or the Earth is between the moon and the sun, right? In that case, we have something known as a spring tide, right? Because the collective gravitational pull of both these bodies adds up, right? Whereas in the other case, when they are at a 90-degree angle, that is when you have something known as a neap tide, right? A neap tide. Now, when we talk about the bulge of the ocean itself, right, it's not quite perfectly as the moon moves along, right? And that is because there is a certain lag, there is a certain period it takes for that bulge to actually move as the moon is moving along, right? So in the last panel, I have tried to show you that with respect to the slight shift, so to say, of the bulge, the central point of the bulge with respect to the moon itself. So by and large, the most significant and the most well-known aspect of the moon's impact on humanity on Earth is, of course, with the tides, right? Now, when we talk about the tides, there are discussions about, for instance, there are many lakes, right? Even in Bharat, we have many lakes which actually are landlocked, right? I mean, Lake Superior, for instance, one of the biggest lakes, it has a measurable tide of about 5 centimeters, right? It's a very interesting aspect because there are different changes that you can see. However, what I am most interested in our discussion is obviously to do with a very important area of India, which is the Gulf of Cambay, right? Which is also called the Gulf of Khambat, right? Khambat. Now, that has the most extreme tidal variations in all of India, right? So the tidal range here can reach up to 11 meters during spring tide. Right? So making it one of the highest tidal ranges, and obviously that affects the way you do fishing, that the way you look at port operations and so on and so forth, right? Now the question is, if you recall or if you are familiar with the Indus Valley, the Saraswati Sindhu distribution of the various cities, so to say, or the habitations, there are some that are actually clustered around the Gulf of Khambat, right? And I'm coming to one in particular, which many of you are familiar with, which is the Lothal port, right? The Lothal port is actually one of India's most ancient, most important tidal dockyard, right? It's a tidal dockyard. And what it shows us is that there was a knowledge of hydrography, right? There was a knowledge of maritime engineering, right? Which was visible by the people of the Sindhu Saraswati civilization, right? For instance, there is a certain place where the ships were sluiced. There's a technique called sluicing, right? Sluiced into the dock, brought into the dock, right? Through a river estuary. It's like a channel, right? Which was flooded by another inlet channel, right? And this was exactly coinciding with the moment when there is a high tide in the Gulf of Khambat. Right? So the entire operation that you have, right, of how the ships are brought in is perfectly synchronized with the high tide, so to say, of the Gulf of Khambat, right? So this we are talking about thousands of years back. We're not talking about modern maritime technology, right? So it is amazing that the correlation of the tides with the movement of, with the ships, so to say, has been looked at. However, having said that, the impact of celestial bodies on this tide was not quite conclusively proven during this time. There's no evidence, documentation, so to say, but we know that the tidal aspect was understood very well by the inhabitants of the Sindhu Saraswati civilization. So the Gulf of Khambat has a tidal range of about 11 meters. So we were discussing about the Saraswati Sindhu civilization, and specific engineering aspect was looked at when we talk about the sluicing of ships, right? The sluicing of ships into the dockyard was through a river estuary that was flooded by an inlet channel during the high tide at the Gulf of Khambat, right? So very interesting aspect thereof. Panikkar and Srinivasan, they are very well-known scholars in this area, also spoke about specific verses of Samved Samhita, Yajurved Samhita, Vajanasai Samhita, the Shatpat Brahman and the Matrayani Upanishad, right? And the correlation of lunar influence and tides, right? So, however, in some of the places, the Som aspect of Som relates more with respect to the Som Ras that we talk about in orthopraxy or in various different rituals. So, one has to be a little careful when we annotate the idea of Som with respect to the idea of the moon. And the tides, so to say. However, having said that, as I already said, engineering wise, we already were accounting for different elements of the tides in a manner of speaking. Now, here I have shown you in this image the Lothal dock, right? I've actually shown you a picture from N.K. Panikkar, which is showing the southern embankment with the two corners. There are two corners on the two sides, and there is a gap in the middle, right? That's called the spillway, right? That's a spillway, and that was very important in the way we kind of did that whole engineering aspect that I was talking about. So the Lothal dock, it's a very prominent part of our civilizational heritage, right? And that has to be accounted for and looked at. Okay. Now, the aspect of tides is also seen in many different aspects of our civilizational heritage in terms of texts, right? So for instance, in the Balakand of Ramayana, we talk about this in a slightly different aspect, right? So we say, Vivardhamano virena samudra eva parvani, Hatmeiva tadamene vasishta mrishi satatam, right? I'll just give you a little bit of context of what is being discussed here. So Vishwamitra, right, is somebody who was at one point blinded by arrogance, right? He was he had acquired many divine weapons, right? And he believed that he could defeat Vashishta, right? Maharishi Vashishta. And now this arrogance of his was looked at as the overwhelming sea during full moon, right? This idea of the full moon, right, and how it affects the ocean, right, because the arrogance of Vishwamitra is spoken of as the overwhelming sea during a full moon, right, which is a very interesting aspect of how it is put forth. And in one context, he actually even goes so far as to use the Brahmastra, right? But it's very interesting because Vashishta actually uses his staff, right? His staff, and then kind of stops the effect, so to say, right? And that's when Vishwamitra understands that there's no point in terms of this egotistic, drive, so to say, and that leads to his realization journey, right, becoming a Brahmarshi. So this is from Sarga 5 of the Balakand of Ramayana, a very important aspect of this. And here we see how the idea of tides comes into the picture in the simile that has been used here, right, for the arrogance. Now in the Jataka tales, right, of Buddhism, Jataka 466 of book 12, right, there it says very interestingly, in thrice 5 days the moon will rise to view, then from the sea a mighty flood is due. This mighty island to overwhelm then haste, elsewhere take shelter that it hurt not you, right? So here we see that in the dark fortnight, right, our gathering is broken up, this further lines, some of the other lines, when on the 15th day from now at the first of the full moon, at the time of the moon's rising, we will bring up the sea and make an end of them all. So you see fortnight, full moon, moon's rising, bringing up the sea, right? These are all aspects which has been translated by W.H.D. Rouse. It's a very well-known work which was published by Cambridge University Press in 1895, right? They had looked at the Jataka 466 and this particular aspect, and here it's very clear the tidal aspect has been discussed about in some detail. Now, in the Vishnu Puran, we have a place where it says, particularly the verses 90 to 92 of chapter 4 of book 2 of the Vishnu Puran, Stalistham Agni Sanyogadu Dreki Salilam Yatha Tadhendu Vridhau Salilam Ambhogo Munisatam Anyunan Tiriktash Varghantyapo Husanti Cha Udyasat Manish Vindo Pakshayo Shulka Krishnayo Dashotarani Panchaiva Hyangulanam Shatani Ve Apama Vridhikshayo Drishto Samudrinam Mahamune, right? So here it's talking about water in a cauldron, right? In a vessel. When it is heated, it expands, right? It expands. So similarly, the waters of the ocean also swell with the moon, right? The waters, although really neither more nor less, right, dilate or contract, quote unquote, dilate or contract. And this is similar to, you saw the bulge, right, in the image that I had shown you for the tides, as the moon increases or wanes in the light and dark fortnights, right? And the rise and fall of the waters of the different seas is 510 inches. There's a certain kind of value that has been annotated, but the idea of this dilation and contraction is very, very interesting and important. So in the Raghuvamsha, Tenata Patramal Mandalena Prashastipa Purva Nivasa Bhumima Babhahu Bulagahu Shashinoditen Velam Udan Vaniva Nyamanaha. Right? So here it says that the army, right, which is under a certain royal insignia, is looking like an ocean that is drawn towards the shore by the risen moon, right? So here again you see the correlation of the moon with the ocean has been spoken about in Shlok 27, Sarga 16 of the Raghuvamsha. So it's a very specific textual reference that I'm talking about out here, right? Now, sure, the tides are something which are natural occurrences, right? These are not human per se. The question is, can the celestial movements affect the humans as well, right? So in this, I would like to touch upon two different dimensions out here, one with respect to the sun and one with respect to, let's say, the other celestial bodies, which I will briefly comment on but not go into too much detail. With respect to the sun, we have something known as heliobiology. Right? Heliobiology basically talks about the way in which solar and geomagnetic activities affect the human health, right? And this is something which since the mid 20th century has been looked at in great detail, right? So in USA, a study into the relationship between the geomagnetic index, there's an index that looks at the geomagnetic activities, and mortality from coronary heart diseases, right, and stroke, had found no meaningful correlations, right? We are talking about a while back, right? This is roughly in 1976, right, when we had this group of Lipas, Tarok and Rogot, right? Lipas, Tarok and Rogot. They had published in Nature in 1976 about this study. Now, Alexander Chizevsky, right, who is also looked at as the pioneer of modern heliobiology, had proposed in 1976 that heightened geomagnetic activities can also be linked with various different kinds of health conditions, right? For instance, myocardial infarction, which basically means a heart attack, right? It's a cardiac arrest. It's a technical term that leads to a cardiac arrest. And in this case, the cardiac muscle tissues, right, due to oxygen deprivation, there is a death of these tissues, so to say, right? And so there are certain other disorders that can come from that. Now, the geomagnetic influence on MCI, right, which is MI rather, myocardial infarction, was looked at by the likes of Chizevsky as well as various others as well, right? So Lipa et al., which is Lipas, Tarok and Rogot, did not find a correlation. However, in a different study, Malin and Srivastav, these were Indian pioneers, they found that there is a strong correlation between geomagnetic aspects and health in India, right? In India, that was their area of focus, right? And the reason they said that there was an influence in India and not in the US is because there is a difference of the artificial magnetic interference, right? They said that there is a certain element of artificial magnetism, right, which is because of different equipments, different human habitation related interferences, and that is affecting the way we are looking at things out there, right? So that is it's still up for debate whether that is indeed the case, because the parametrization of that external influence was not quite done in this justification that was given by Malin and Srivastav. Thereafter in 1989, Brios, right, he conducted a very important study where he looked at 6.3 million ambulance diagnoses in Moscow during a high solar activity period, right, which was in 1979 to 81 roughly. And their findings basically confirmed that the magnetic storm, right, which was there, the magnetic disturbance, the geomagnetic activity, had an impact on 85,819 myocardial infarction cases, right? So this basically led to, this was one of the major works, right, which led to, at this scale, right, we're talking about 6.3 million ambulance diagnoses and 85,819 myocardial infarction cases, right? So this led to heliobiology being taken a little more seriously, right? Because till that point there was, the two different approaches, one in US, one in India, that were the seminal papers, right? Both published in Nature, so to say, right? Which is the most preeminent journals in the scientific world, right? Now, when we talk about the impact of geomagnetic disturbances, it is very interesting because this is the other way in which celestial bodies impact us, right? Moon impacts us, sun impacts us. You may have seen the aurora borealis, right? The very beautiful sky lights, right? These are lights, streaking lights, right? They say that when the devtas, this is the more mythological or the more kind of metaphysical aspect of it, right? When they travel, right? That is when the lights streak out in the way they do, right? But of course, there's a very specific physics based reason for this, which relates to the way in which particles get entrapped in the magnetic kind of channel, so to say, right? There are certain specific patterns that converge at the polar area, and that is why this happens. Now, going back to the discussion we were having, so it was seen that in such places where there is an auroral belt, the impact of geomagnetic effects or activities is much more on the health of the individual, right? So this was looked at by Charnos et al, right, in 2001, and they saw that aurora disturbance sensitive people, there was a name given to this, ADSP, right? That is where there is a certain magnetic disturbance effect that is being seen as such, right? Now, there was a very important work that was done in 1990 to 93, right, which is by Stoppel, Martfeld, and Rottenberg. Right, this study looked at 1,185 consecutive days and patients which were being treated for stroke, right, as well as paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. Right, this is a certain health condition. There were about 977 of the stroke patients and about 653 of the other kind. And the main results that came across were that there was a negative correlation between the paroxysmal atrial fibrillation, this condition, and the geomagnetic activity level, right? Number one. Number two, the number of daily admissions for paroxysmal atrial fibrillation was higher on the geomagnetic quiet condition days rather than the ones which had more stormy conditions when we talk about geomagnetism, so to say, right? And lastly, the stroke admissions showed the same highly significant negative correlation between increasing geomagnetic activity but decreasing stroke admission, so to say, right? The negative correlation, right? But only in males of 65 years or less, right? So these were the three main findings or results of the Stoppel, Martfeld, Rottenberg study, which gave in very specific terms for two health conditions the impact that sun, or rather not sun, but geomagnetic activity had on the health of individual human beings, right? So this is very important to highlight here. Right? Now, I'll just quickly go over some of the other studies. I'll not focus too much on that. So the effect of geomagnetic disturbances on ischemic heart diseases, they are called IHD, right? This was done by Garfinkel in Moscow in Russia, and there were about 80 patients, 47 male and 33 female, and there was daily monitoring for 3 weeks. What they saw that there were capillary changes. You have capillaries in our body, right? Capillary action, your different blood vessels, right? Capillary changes during magnetic storms, right? This was one of the first things that was seen, and that led to perivascular edema, that led to red blood cell aggregation, also reduced flow of blood, right? There were also angina patients who experienced a lot of disturbances. There was an impact of geomagnetic activity almost 2.5 times greater than the atmospheric pressure changes, so to say, right? So this was in Moscow. Then we come to a very interesting study in Italy, which looked at the impact of geomagnetic activity on blood pressure, right? So there were about 447 patients, right? And it was seen that there is a correlation between geomagnetic index and blood pressure. And there was no correlation between the systolic blood pressure at night time or the heart rate per se, but in general, when you talk about daytime systolic or diastolic pressures, there was a correlation that they found between the geomagnetic index and the blood pressure, so to say. We also had a similar study which was done in Naples in Italy. This was in 2002 with 30 individuals, and there was also a correlation of 0.53 which was found between conductivity and geomagnetic index. There was blood pressure showed some positive correlations with sunspot areas, and systolic and diastolic pressures, the correlation strength and delay times were not quite consistent throughout, right? So there is an interesting aspect thereof. Now, when we talk about cardiovascular health, right? Cardiovascular health, there was a very interesting study by Watanabe in 2001, which was done in Tokyo, Japan, right? This was basically with one single individual for 11 years, right? This was a time, series kind of a study, so to say, right? And the blood pressure, the heart rate, and the heart rate variability were looked at. and it was seen that there's an inverse relationship between the solar activity, which was parameterized in terms of something known as the Wolf number, and heart rate variability, how the heart rate varies, right? It fluctuates, so to say, right? And there was a solar cycle stage dependent association of the heart rate with the solar activity also, right? This was in Tokyo in 2001. Thereafter, in Minnesota in the US, another such study was done, again with myocardial infarction, which I talked about, heart attacks, during peak solar activity years, right? So there was a 5% increase in myocardial infarction with respect to the peak solar activity years. And there was a positive correlation between heart rates and sunspot numbers, as well as a 7.6% increase in the incidences of myocardial infarction with respect to different kinds of magnetic field reversals which happened, right, during that period of time. So very interesting and important aspects. However, when we talk about such studies, right, there are certain challenges that we find in terms of understanding the direct impact, right? So one of the problems that we see is that the energy transfer that happens from, let's say, electromagnetic fields to the system, our human body, the biological system, it is much lower, right, than which is needed for classical physics based or physiochemical interactions, right? So there's a certain problem in terms of the strength, so to say, of the electromagnetic aspect, right? And these are seen in very specific frequencies of electromagnetic fields, right? So when we talk about electromagnetics, there are certain frequencies, right? We know about radio waves, X-rays, visible light, and so on and so forth, right? So electromagnetic fields have frequencies, but these effects are seen only in what is called as the ELF spectrum. This is a very specific spectrum with a certain range of frequencies only, right? And then finally, this also, rather than following the traditional dose-response relationship, this actually manifests across the multiple dose ranges, right? Which is very, very tricky, because when we do a study of this kind, right, we look at certain intensity windows, right? And they have to be kind of specific, they have to be defined in a certain way, and that also creates a problem. So ELF, by the way, is extremely low frequencies, and they come in the range of 3 Hz to 3 kHz, right? So that is the range of the ELF. And so when we talk about biological effects of ELF non-ionizing electromagnetic fields, which is what we are talking about here, to put it into very scientific terminology, so to say, these are the various specific challenges that we have, right? Now, having said that, there is a very interesting aspect which I also saw in one of the texts which I was reading for the Kumbh Mela, as well as in a different context, which is the idea of resonance, right? We always say that when we go to a mandir, right, we resonate with the energy that we find out there, right? There is a certain resonance that is established based on the energy that prayers, that spiritual activities bring forth, right? Now, in the context of how the ionosphere, right, and the earth, so Earth's surface and the ionosphere, the atmosphere itself, right? If you think of them as a cavity, as a small chamber, right? The surface itself, right, and the ionosphere, right? There is a hypothesis, there is a study rather, or area of research which talks about something known as the Schumann resonance, right? The Schumann resonance basically looks at the resonance of electromagnetic waves which are trapped in this cavity, right? So there are certain resonances, so to say, right? And they do occur in the ELF band, right? In the 5 to 60 kind of hertz, not 5 kilohertz, but 5 to 60 hertz, so to say, right? The Schumann resonances are excited by the global lightning activities at times, right? So the fundamental mode of this is predicted to be around 10.6 hertz, right? And the higher harmonics are 18.4, 26 hertz, 33.5 hertz, and 41.1 hertz, right? Though their actual observed frequencies are a little lesser because of damping. So when we talk about the experimental observations, right, we have about as I said, 40% damping, right, from the actual from the thing that we have predicted. The average frequency of minimum power circulating in this cavity aligns with the dominant human brain rhythm, so to say, which is very important, because that is where we can talk about the resonance in the atmosphere and the resonance that we have within our own brain structures, right? So this alignment, right, this average frequency of minimum power circulation is what makes us wonder whether this can actually have an impact on us or not, and the answer is probably yes, right? So the resonance frequency, the idea of resonance is what is very important, right? So when we talk about ionospheric disturbances, right, like the solar proton events, for instance, or solar X-ray bursts, they often influence the Schumann resonance frequencies. And the changes in the Schumann resonance frequencies are overlaid on the natural diurnal variations that are caused by the solar heating, right? And all of this together, the hypothesis, because of what I just mentioned about the human brainwave rhythm, can have a certain alignment, so to say, in simple parlance. Okay. Now, when we talk about the possible mechanisms beside the Schumann frequency resonance matching, right, there are various different theories, right? So Lednev, for instance, in 91 spoke about how the ELF electromagnetic fields can affect ions, right? Ions such as which are weakly bound within some proteins in the human body, right? For instance, calmodulin, right? Calmodulin is one which was spoken of, and this was referred to as, this entire process was referred to as parametric resonance, right? So when we have the alteration of the binding state of these ions, right, such as calcium ion, for instance, that can basically lead to an influence on the physiological processes, right? So there is a certain way in which the ELF field affects the ions which are within these proteins, and that in turn affects the physiological processes, right? So these protein bound ions can also cause these bond distortions, right? These bond distortions that can take place. So that was also linked to this aspect. Now, when we talk about NMR, right, there was also another theory or mechanism proposed, which is that the charged nuclei within the human body, when with the spin, can couple with these magnetic fields, right, with the ELF range field, so to say. However, the physiological relevance is questionable because of the low abundance of these isotopes. There are certain chemical elements and the weak field strengths, right, which is found. So therefore, this theory is not quite tenable beyond a point, right? And so electromagnetic fields can also have free radical reactions, right? I'll not go into too much of detail on the chemistry of it. So if you have something known as triplet to singlet transitions, you can have something by the idea of free radical reactions. And finally, you can basically have something whereby the inability of any of these alone, right, makes us wonder whether there is a multi-tiered or a multi-dimensional approach, right? It's not only the ions, it's not only the magnetic field charged nuclei, it's not only the Schumann reaction or the resonance, sorry, rather, it is a combination of this, and this is exactly what has been proposed in recent past as to the best possible hybrid model, so to say, in which the geomagnetic storms or geomagnetic activities can actually affect the human anatomy. However, having said that, the ability of natural ELF radiations to affect human health is quite minimal, however, because of the strength of the field themselves as well as the coupling thereof. But there is some work and some progress in terms of understanding how and where the geomagnetic and the heliocentric aspects, so to say, of radiation, of activities can affect human anatomy, physiology in a direct way, right? So, well, the question of how Jupiter affects us in terms of, when we talk about the Kumbh Mela, that obviously has more to do with the astrological interpretations. As a person of science, I would say that we do not have enough sufficient evidence or work at the moment to either ascertain or negate that, so to say, right? So I will just keep to that. But in terms of heliobiology, there has definitely been work over the last 50 years, over the last 100 years actually, which talks about very specific mechanisms, the challenges, and the ways in which we can understand that and how it actually affects, right, or may affect. Now, before I move on to the other section, I would just briefly like to highlight that Western astrology, right, or the zodiac, which is basically looking at fate, looking at different aspects of personality, is something that has been challenged, right? I mean, I go back to the idea that I believe that it was because of Hellenistic interpolations that there was a significant degree of preeminence given to the astrological aspect instead of the mathematical or the astronomical aspect, so to say. Now, there are two studies that I would like to quickly point out, one with respect to 15,000 participants, and that looked at the personality and general intelligence with respect to the date of birth, right? And so the simplistic way in which this was looked at was not quite simplistic in the sense of how it was undertaken, but the emphasis was on this aspect with respect to Western zodiacs, of course. And so there was no association found for the relation between sun signs and traits. so to say. The other one was a very well-known work on a double-blind test for astrology. And there too, the way in which it was undertaken, this was done in the US. The Western astrologers failed to perform better than what chance would do in a double-blind test, right? So I would again highlight that I think what we have somewhere along the line lost out on is the aspect of the rigor, right? Or we rather don't discuss that as much as we should because of the colonial aspect, right, of the westernization that we see, which is prevalent today, which has to be kind of corrected for if we are to look at Jyotish Ganita or Ganita Jyotish in the Indian context. Now, we talk about the snan, right, the Shahi snan, so to say, in the holy waters of the Sangam. The question is there a physiological effect, right? So we spoke about the celestial aspect, the scientific celestial aspects of heliobiology and how that affects or does not affect different aspects of human beings and their systems. Does the water itself, right, of the Sangam have something of importance or something which helps with human health that we can focus on, is the next question. Now, it just so happens that there has been a certain narrative, right, which has a certain relevance and which has to be looked at and is being looked at actively by the government and various other non-governmental organizations working on the ground, which is that of pollution, which is that of going beyond the critical level of well-being with respect to the water quality, right? However, when it was seen in 2019, there was a study done by Kalpana Srivastava, which was published. And here, basically, this was after the Kumbh Mela in 2019. It was seen that different parameters, right? So you see that there is the different parameters like pH, the concentration of carbonate, chloride, there is a total hardness, calcium, magnesium, phosphate, silicate, so on and so forth. And there are the different stages of the Kumbh Mela. So Makar Sankranti, Mauni Amavasya, Basant Panchami, Maghi Purnima and Mahashivratri. And it was seen that after about the bathing of about 200 million people, this caused a slight increase in some of the parameters of the pollution levels, right? But the river did stabilize. The river did stabilize in terms of what we can regard as a self-purification process or a stabilization process, so to say. So the cessation of industrial and commercial or domestic effluents, right, along with a continuous upstream water release, showed us that it does not lead to a critical situation, right? It does not lead to a critical situation, and the continuous river flow can mitigate the impact of negative ecological aspects of things like mass bathing, for that matter, right? So this study, right, was one of the many other studies which have been done, which looks at busting this Hindu-phobic narrative that just because Hindus go and bathe in the Sangam, right, the pollution levels have reached a critical value which is beyond redemption, right? Because this work clearly shows us the parameters and how a good flow of the river waters can prevent that from happening, right? It's just like when we talk about in Diwali, right? We often talk about the pollution levels, but we often forget that it's the stubble burning, right, which has caused an immense lot of problems in the state of Delhi, in the northern states out there, even in our neighboring country of Pakistan, for that matter, right? So the idea that Diwali is the reason for that, again, is something which has a nuance of Hinduphobia, a Hindumissia, if you will, which has to be spoken against when it is required. Similarly, in the Mahakumbh, the idea of pollution and self-correction or self-stabilization, right, of the Ganga, of the Sangam is very much important to be highlighted, so to say. Now, in this respect, I would like to bring you back to an interesting study, which is, or rather, highlight an interesting study which was done in 1896, okay? This was by a bacteriologist by the name of Ernest Hanbury Hankin. He was studying the waters of the Yamuna and Ganga rivers, Ma Ganga and Ma Yamuna, and particularly with respect to the idea of cholera microbes, right? So what he was trying to see was whether there is any aspect of a bacteriophage, right? What is a bacteriophage? A bacteriophage is basically a virus that devours or kills the bacteria, right? So there he said in his report, in his paper, this is his paper, that's himself, right? He says that there seems to be an antiseptic substance present in the waters of the Ganges and the Jamuna river, right? This is mentioned in his work, and he says that commenting on this bacteriological purity, Hankins said that there could be a number of possible reasons: absence of polluting factories initially. This is his initial kind of commentary. Sparsely concentrated villages. There are different self-purificatory aspects which are helping in the vicinity, right? But having looked at all of them, right, there was also this element that there was Agra city, right? And Agra city was putting in effluence. There were many other aspects that cut across this various other arguments, right? And thereafter he came to this thought, which I just highlighted, that there is potentially an antiseptic substance present in the waters, right? Now, bacteriological examination of these waters showed that there were very few microbes with respect to the European rivers, so to say, right? So that's a very interesting work that was out there. And also, if you see that pilgrimage sites always had a certain element of cholera microbes, right? Not least because there were, he says this. I mean, this is his words, that dying of cholera, condemned beyond redemption, and burnt at those places, right, leads to the cholera microbes being spread around in certain ways, both in airborne as well as waterborne aspects, so to say, right? However, this was not found to be the case in his studies, in the chemical studies, in the way he looked at it, so to say, right? Now, it's very interesting that Hankins is also the person who made the first Pasteur Institute in the country, by the way. In 1900, he had kind of, in Kasoli, he had founded the first bacteriological institute. And this work on the bacteriophage was actually 20 years before this discussion started in the West, right? I will come to that shortly. So the idea that the river Ganga, right, gave the inspiration for this work of a bacteriophage is a very interesting area of research, of work, of thought, which not many people know about beyond a point, right? This is not being widely spoken about, right? So Hankins' observations had been regarded by some as the earliest description of bacteriophage activity, right? Nearly 50 years before, the elaborations given in 1915 to 1917 by the likes of Frederick Twort, for instance, and Felix de Herel, right? So you can, look into this. Theirs was the work on bacterial viruses in 1915 to 17. But a good 50 years before that, Hankins was already looking at certain aspects of this in the context of the Ganga River, right? Ma Ganga as such. Now, even Mark Twain, right, who has, well, many different aspects to his work, and I wouldn't comment on that per se, but he mentioned in this quote, and I would like to kind of highlight this quote here. He says, and I quote, "In certain ways, the foul and derided Ganges River, right, or water, is the most puissant purifier in the world," right? The words foul and derided, right, gives you a certain perspective of where that thought is coming from, right? However, even he has to go on and say, and puissant purifier. For ages and ages, the Hindus have had absolute faith that the water of Ganges was utterly pure, could not be defiled by any contact whatsoever, and infallibly made pure and clean whatsoever touched it, right? They still believe it, and that is why they bathe in it, they drink it, caring nothing for its seeming filthiness and floating corpses. The Hindus have been laughed at these many generations. So you see, constantly there is a certain element of, hitting at the Hindus, at, the Ganga itself, but at the same time praising these various other elements. But the laughter will need to modify itself a little from now on. How did they find out the water's secret in those ancient ages? Had they germ scientists then? We do not know, right? So he talks about germ scientists as well, right? This is Mark Twain talking. We all know his works, right? Thereafter, Stephen Abaddon, right? He was a very big critic of Hankin. Even he had to say that a very phage-like specificity where the Ganges river water was not active against certain V. cholera strains, whereas the Jumna river was, right? Similarly, the Jumna river was not active against typhoid bacillus. This specificity particularly can be taken as phage property, right? The property of viruses that kill bacteria. While Hankin clearly appears to have discovered a bactericidal property associated with the Indian river waters, Hankin's experiments seem to be inconsistent with the property being due to the presence of phages. So he does go on and criticize Hankin for methodological reasons, but in the beginning, in the preamble to this quote, he does speak about how there has to be some degree of phage activity for this specificity of sorts to have come forth, right? So this is Abaddon, who is a fierce critic of Hankin's work and his phage activity claim, right, so to say, right? So now, coming to the modern scientific perspective, Whether this is true or not is something which is still being discussed, right? And there have been many works, derivative works, which have sided with Hankin, right? However, I'd like to go a little away from that and talk about the idea of confluence of rivers, where the rivers meet, right? Are there some interesting aspects there, right? So where the rivers meet, there are certain places called confluence hydrodynamic zones, right? These are called CHZs, right? These are looked at with in terms of shifts in flow dynamics. The flow of the river shifts in some ways, right? This flow is not the same basically, right? And they have certain very specific biogeochemical processes, right? This has to be understood. So nitrogen in the river, right? The nitrogen dynamics in the river where there are confluences, combined the molecular biological tools. There were various kind of modeling tools that were looked at, and they saw that the nitrogen transformation is distinct in the CHZs rather than where there is a normal hydrodynamic zone, right? So the nitrogen is a very important aspect, as you all may know, in biology, in chemistry, so to say, in biological chemistry, right? And CHZs were seen as hotspots for nitrogen removal, right? This is very important because nitrogen in certain forms is not very good, right, to be having, with significantly high rates of N2 production also, right? So there are certain spots for removal as well as for, so there was a very nuanced study thereof, right? And this was looked at by microbial species. This production was looked at by microbial species like Pteromonas, for instance, and Sphingobacterium, right? Sphingobacterium, which looked at nitrate and nitrite reduction, right? So the microbial activities were shown to persist downstream, right? And their influence on the lower reaches basically looked at the flow ratio of tributaries to the mainstream. So there were some aspects of these ratios which told us more about how the microbial activities were taking place, right? So you see, from a modern scientific perspective, there is an aspect of nitrogen, of certain specific chemicals that do have a certain impact because of the flow dynamics of the area that we're talking about in terms of confluence or normal hydrodynamic zones, right? And this is something which has been published in the Journal of Hydrology in 2022, right? A couple of years back, right? So we see that there isn't a general composition difference all that much, right? However, there are certain nitrogen transformation processes that are looked at in the confluence hydrodynamic zones, which are a certain way, as I was just discussing, right? So Hankin's work as well as this current work that has been done both show that the waters of these places, these confluences, especially with respect to, given Hankin's work, with respect to the Sangam, is something which is of significance, right? This has to be looked at very closely, right? Lastly, I would like to highlight in the historical context the immense importance of crowd control, right? Crowd control, because the akhadas, the warrior ascetic groups, the monastic groups, the way there was a self-organization of the Hindu community, of the pilgrims out there, right? Before there was a centralized state, before, when we were having problems politically speaking, right? Is an amazing aspect of logistical and systems control, right? And this is something which has historically been looked at, where large-scale gatherings, particularly in the 18th century, 19th century, in fact, even after that, in some of the places, there was an inspiration in the nationalistic movement also, which derived from the Kumbh Mela, right, in 1857 and even beyond, right? There are anecdotes of that as well, right? The akhadas themselves were very martial in their own way. They resisted many of the colonial powers, so to say, as well, right? So there is a certain cultural dimension that I have to highlight here and which is of importance. The last section of my talk today will be basically on how technology has basically helped a lot in terms of Kumbh as we know it. And this is a very refreshing thing because, as I said, our traditions have been very scientific in their own ways. They have been very rigorous, and bringing in technology in that way makes it even more so, right? It's another dimension being added to that, right? So the central government and the government of UP, for instance, have looked at how Google Maps, right, can now integrate the temporary tent city itself into their structuring, right? So I did see this, that the ghats, the temples, the centers of the different akhadas, right, and the camps, so to say, there is a certain aspect of real-time guidance that you can have now with respect to the integration of this into Google Maps, right? right? Then you have something which is an AI-powered van, right, which is looking at solid waste, because if you have so many devotees and pilgrims coming, right, there has to be a way in which the segregation of the waste and the disposition, the disposal of the waste has to be looked at, right? So there are about 1.5 lakh empties of solid waste, right, that has been tackled by the AI powered vans, right? Then you also have the 360-degree VR experience, right? You can actually look at the Peshwai, right, the Shahi Snan nowadays with the virtual reality aspect, right? You have 2000 drones that have come up, right, that have looked at tales of Prayag Mahatmayam, the Mahakumbh, for instance. This is an amazing kind of aspect that has also added to this. The AI aspect also has been looked at in crowd control, right? So there are about there are 24/7 surveillances, right? 2,700 CCTV cameras, right? 328 of them have AI equipped aspects, right? And just like we talk about Chandrayaan and Mangalyaan and how AI has helped in that, even in this aspect, which is very much to do with our traditions, we have ensured that AI helps us in terms of maintaining the order and decorum of it, right? Finally, you have the Sahayak chatbot, right, app, which has worked on this aspect in terms of giving you some elements of event updates, for instance, right? This is an app that you can have on your phone, and then remote control life buoys, very important for rescue operations that have been studied as well, right? Cyber warriors, there are many security displays. If you go to Mahakumbh, you will see that there are 56 cyber warriors that will monitor the online threats, right? I mean, and there are 40 VMDs, variable messaging displays, that will keep on telling you about cyber security awareness in those vicinities, right? So all in all, this extra dimension of cutting edge technology, right, adds to this discourse, this narrative of the science, the scientific perspective on the Mahakumbh, which we have to take in a very nuanced way, but however, not be apologetic about where it is not required, right? Not to make claims which cannot be obviously corroborated by empirical evidence, but at the same time highlighting with very rigorous ways, how we do have a very scientific way of doing things. I would like to bring my talk around and close it with this very interesting picture, which is a picture by Ada Lee in 1909, which is showing us the Magh Mela at Ganga Sagar, West Bengal, right? Bengal today is burning, right? Bengal on both sides of the international border is facing immense civilization and dharmic problems, essentially, right? It is facing challenges. And I think the need of the hour is to look at the dharmic heritage, so to say, right? And the Magh Mela is a very important part of West Bengal, right? And the Banchberia Kumbh Mela, for instance, after 700 years, we have come back towards celebrating that. So with that thought in mind and the hope that we will go forward with something which has inherent rigor in terms of metaphysics, philosophy, mathematics, fluid dynamics, social behavior, and so many other dimensions and nuances of human thought and society, I would like to bring this discussion to a close. And I wish you all on the occasion of Mahakumbh, and I look forward to seeing you very soon at Sangam Talks. Namaskar.